What happens when a promoter texts you, "I'm working on this event and we'd love to have a guitar player from the district play this beautiful and legendary status song. I thought of you, what do you think?" And at the same time that I'm really excited to do it and even think to myself, I have the perfect guitar for it that I had made for these specific scenarios and you wouldn't even imagine, but I love the song and I've been wanting to cover it for years. There's only one problem. I look at my schedule and calendar, and between work and all sorts of other projects, I only have a maximum of 10 days to work on it. Crazy, right? Perhaps. This is what this documentary is all about. This is an obvious example of what I like to call the autopilot syndrome. Nothing very crazy here. This might be the only time I have to practice.
I left my backpack at home.
My computer just can't handle it. You really can't tell I'm sick. So update, it sucks ass. It sounds really, really bad. Gonna have to figure out another solution. And because I'm Portuguese, probably our most recognizable genre would be Fado music, or I guess for like an American pronunciation would be Fado. And it's known for being a very melancholic, kind of sad music, but it is much richer than that. In fact, between different areas of the country, there's even different variations with different techniques, different specs and instruments, and even very often completely different vibes. So while this pseudo-documentary of mine isn't really going to showcase all the differences between all the different Fado genres, and I'm not really going to be playing Fado in the traditional sense, I hope that this is maybe a way to introduce some of you guys who never heard of this genre of music to go do some research not only on the artists that we're going to be talking about, but even some different artists and who knows, even other Portuguese genres of music. Now talking about the composer himself, Carlos Paredes, I kind of feel like we have to talk a little bit about his dad too, because Carlos Paredes is the son of Artur Paredes, who was also a renowned Portuguese guitar player, but his father and the father of his father were also renowned musicians. So we're talking about a whole lineage of musicians who are not only known for being extremely good musicians and popular musicians, well, popular might be a peculiar word, but we'll get to it, but also extremely influential culturally and musically. Before, I talked a little bit about Fado music and how different areas of the country have their own little vibes and inspirations with different techniques and flavors. Well, I live in the more central area of Portugal, and I'm close to Coimbra, which is, who would have known where the Fado of Coimbra is from. And Artur Paredes, back in like the 1920s, was already renowned for not only having a beautiful and renowned style, and people felt like, while with other players, you could go look back for previous recordings and previous artists and be like, oh yeah, this guitar player was influenced by this artist or this artist. People didn't really feel that way about Artur Paredes. And not only did he change the way that music was made, with vibes, no choices, and other techniques, but also with instrument craft and instrument making. You guys might know that I'm involved and work with a bunch of luthiers, and help set up this like luthier show where all sorts of luthiers who make all sorts of instruments can come and present their work. And even nowadays, a lot of the way that Portuguese guitars are made stem back to the 1920s because of Artur Paredes, who was like, yeah, I want an instrument that allows me to like tune lower. I want an instrument that allows me to have a bigger, more full sound and more aggressive sound. The instruments that are being built right now, they don't really accommodate what I want to do. So he went to instrument makers and was like, please make me something that achieves what I want to do. And back then, instrument makers didn't really work like that, in the way that their instruments were supposed to be made according to tradition and technique. It wasn't really part of the culture to make something new for a player because the player has different needs. But even then, after trying a bunch of these things, the luthier started noticing like, oh, this actually makes sense. The scale length is now more in tune with itself. Or maybe the neck width allows us to play different chords and chord shapes. I don't play the Portuguese guitar because I didn't really have that much contact with it growing up. And while it is just a stringed instrument, which I can technically play, because it is tuned in fifths and the regular guitar is tuned in fourths, I kind of have to readjust my brain often, so I wouldn't really call myself a Portuguese guitar player, but it's a beautiful sounding instrument, a lot more trebly, a lot more attacky. It's kind of like a 12-string guitar where all the strings are doubled, which gives you a little bit of a more attacky, metallic-y, trebly sound, which kind of has this like symbolical connotation and similarities with crying. And while there's a bunch of stories that I can tell you about Artur Paredes and then later his son Carlos Paredes, and how their stories and careers kind of influenced each other, I'm just going to give you like this brief statement, which you can then research later. And like I said before, I might be somewhat wrong about all of this, but like I watched a couple of documentaries and did some research, so I think I'm not going to say anything completely wrong about it. So Carlos Paredes, the son of Artur Paredes, born around the 1920s, when his dad's career really started to pick up, he started learning how to play the Portuguese guitar along with his dad around the age of like 4 to 6 years old. And while his mom kind of wanted him to learn how to play the violin or the piano, he kind of didn't really enjoy it that much, so he just stayed with the guitar. He quickly started developing his own sound, which was of course influenced by the previous iterations of Portuguese guitar, especially in the more Coimbra tradition of Fado music. But both him and his dad would take influences from more regional types of music, more folk types of music, and even try to apply some of the stylistic things about different styles of Fado. Carlos played with his dad, Artur, for a bunch of years, but they kind of had to go their separate ways, not only for stylistic reasons and competitive reasons. Like there's even this somewhat fun story told by the son of the luthier who used to build the guitars for Carlos's dad, Artur, in which they were building him him a new guitar and they were working heavily on it, but then some sort of accident went on and the top of the guitar cracked or got busted or something like that. And so the luthier was like, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Arthur, I'll just build you a new guitar from scratch. And his son Carlos was like, hey, I kind of want a new guitar as well, so like, why not use the scraps and just put a new top on it and I'll take the old one. And while Artur ended up having a brand new guitar that was also built specifically for his needs, legend says that he was kind of pissed and salty about it, not only because he was like, damn, that guitar was supposed to be for me, but also because in some ways he was like, yeah, sure, he's my son, but like, do your own thing, like, stop coming after me and trying to impose yourself on me. Like, those sorts of things that can happen when there's two very explosive and fiery, creative and artistic minds going on. Both of them kind of knew what they wanted to do with their own music. And I feel like it's also important to mention that both Artur and Carlos, because, you know, Portugal didn't really have a lot of infrastructure or support to artists and art, both him and his dad had other jobs other than being musicians. Artur used to work at a bank and Carlos used to work at a hospital in the more administrative services. So no matter how culturally relevant or not technically they had their own jobs, and while they had passion for playing music, Carlos himself used to say that his engagement with people at work and people who would come into the hospital really fueled him into creating songs and compositions, and it was part of the way it sparked his creativity. Carlos, of course, influenced by his dad as well, kinda started distinguishing himself because he was a bit more reckless, he was a bit more modern and trying to do different things, while Artur, while still being a complete powerhouse that is considered very innovative until this day and even back then, somehow was a little bit more traditional in his approach, or at least the sort of sounds and songs he would make, while Carlos ventured a little bit more off into different things.
Isto foi caro, com certeza.
Now, Artur ended up dying at around 80 years old in 1980, and like 24 years later, Carlos Paredes ended up dying as well at 79 years old from some sort of nervous system problem. But even to this day, their legacy is not only enormous, and their influence among players is absolutely undeniable. With all this commentary, I only really scratched the surfaces of their lives. Like, I haven't even talked about how Carlos was like this guy who was very sure of his skills and his work, but at the same time, he was his biggest critic. The sort of dude that would be chilling and would have a gig and be surprised that people would show up. They would tell stories of like, here's our entertainer for the night, Carlos Paredes, and then he wouldn't come into the stage. He was just chilling backstage because it was cool in there and he was catching a breeze. He really was the sort of artist that would do his art for the sake of art making, for the sake of self-expression, and wanting to do what he was good at and what he wanted to do all his life, not really worried about what other people thought of his music or if his songs would be commercially viable, because when they used to ask him like, is your music popular music or more niche music? And he would give answers like, well, in some ways it's niche, but in some ways it's popular, but it's kind of neither, and I kind of like don't give a fuck. I just do my music the way I want to do it. And I think that's something that all artists should aspire to do, regardless of them being born in the 1920s or maybe the 2020s. Now, one thing that is often talked about Carlos Paredes, other than his note choices and his compositions and his just like flair when playing, is his timing. I've mentioned it during the vlog, and I'm pretty sure all of you guys have heard like some sort of solo player doing their own arrangement and being a little bit more free with time, right? Like, in some ways, tempo is just a frame of mind. But if there's one thing that other players talked about Carlos Paredes, probably unanimously, is that he kind of had his own definition of tempo and pacing. There are all sorts of players, Portuguese and non-Portuguese players, like Charlie Haden is an example of a renowned musician who would not only comment on Carlos Paredes' just natural proficiency at the instrument and his own special flair and taste.
Someone had told me about Carlos Paredes, this great guitarist, Portuguese guitarist. They wanted me to meet him, and he was playing at the Jazz Hot Club.
Oh, yeah.
And I went with some friends to the Hot Club and met Carlos Paredes and asked him if I could sit in with him. And we played all night. It was very wonderful.
Played then.
Yeah. And I knew then that I somehow had to do something in a great musical setting with this guy, because he was a genius.
But in general, between colleagues, contemporaries, and other musicians, they would often mention that when playing along to Carlos, they would kinda need to, quote-unquote, breathe like he did. How fast and slow some of the turnarounds were, how much tempo would fluctuate. Sometimes it didn't really make sense for the people accompanying him, unless they would really lock in with Carlos and try to not only understand where he was coming from, but truly lock in. The version that I based myself on for this arrangement and I kinda listened to on YouTube is probably one of the most straight out of all the versions that you can find online. Like, yeah, it had some speed downs and some slow flow-ups, but in general you can pretty easily follow it. But if you listen to some of the movie versions, those ones are way more crazy. Very often Carlos would be accompanied by Fernando Alvim, another Portuguese guitar player, in this case like regular classical guitar, even though more in the Fado genre and more traditional genres rather than like classical guitar itself. And in the same way that people would compliment Carlos's more free time and kind of wild spirit way to approach tempo, which to be honest I would guess probably comes to him very naturally and wasn't anything like super forced. They would also compliment Fernando Alvim to be kind of like the only guy who would be able to lock in that easily with him. I'm sure it's probably one of those things where one hand washes the other, and Fernando Alvim probably influenced Carlos's timing a little bit and vice versa, and they would easily lock in with each other probably because they would play so often together. But even then, compared to some other Fado arrangements where people will often tell you that it's not exactly the type of genre that people would dance to, some players would be harder for audiences to lock in with when it came to rhythm and tempo, and Carlos Paredes is one of those examples. In case I wasn't obvious enough with the rest of the documentary, I'm not really a connoisseur or like a deep knowledgeable fan of Carlos Paredes and his life and work, but he's definitely someone that I have a huge amount of respect towards, not only as a fellow Portuguese and fellow musician, and in some ways fellow guitar player, but also as someone whose music I listen to and I kind of feel like I connect with, I kind of feel like I vibe with. Sure, we all enjoy all sorts of music and artists, but I feel like when we listen to someone who kind of has sensibilities that are similar to ours, we kind of lock in a little bit harder, we kind of feel a heavier connection, and I will often hear him play these licks and phrases, and sometimes even different ways to like structure chords and do chord inversions, not even mentioning compositions in general, and just feel like somehow I relate to it, you know? So while I'm not here trying to be like, oh yeah, I'm like #1 fan of Carlos Paredes, not even close, I am someone who was aware of his work, and throughout this experience learned even more about it and became not only a bigger fan of his work, and then big admirer in his influence, and in some ways his dad's influence as well, not only when it comes to Portuguese culture and history in general, but also in the center area of Portugal where I happen to be involved in, and I hope he has been resting in peace, and if for some reason anyone from his management team or family ends up seeing this, I leave here vows of respect, and hopefully even if this video just reaches one person who ends up watching this whole thing and being any bit more aware of this important figure in our culture anywhere worldwide. I mean, that's kind of the reason why I do these videos in English, so that I can share my work, and in this case other people's work as well, throughout the whole world in a more universally accepted language. If there's at least one person that enjoys this, then I think we've probably done something nice.
Hello there. So I don't know if you know, but this is part of a documentary I made. Now, you can hypothetically just wait a couple of days until a new shorter video where it's all segmented down will come out, or you can just go into my YouTube channel and watch the full documentary, which was honestly how I envisioned this content to go, but not everyone's going to go watch a long documentary, so yeah, either go watch the documentary or just wait a couple of days. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and leave a like, comment, subscribe, follow, and stay tuned for more if you want to indeed stay tuned for more.